Have you ever witnessed a small moment that makes your heart stop? A glance, a sigh, a seemingly harmless attitude, but enough to make someone feel like they don't belong. On an international flight, a polite, casually dressed black man just wanted to put his suitcase in the overhead compartment. However, just because of his appearance, a flight attendant rolled her eyes and said in a suggestive tone, "That suitcase is not for first class." If it were you in that moment, what would you do? Be patient, get angry, or smile and let it go, like every other time in your life. Today's story is a choice between reaction and courage, between retaliation and changing the system. And I believe, after listening, you will ask yourself, if it were me, what would I choose? If you are interested in stories that touch on human dignity, justice, and life-shaping moments, please gently press like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get into the story. LAX Terminal, 6 inches. The morning always has a very special beauty. The early morning sunlight falls on the shiny tiles, like pale honey filtering through the stream of people rushing by. The rustling of suitcases mixed with the announcements from the loudspeakers, creating a unique rhythm that only those who have flown too much will find familiar. Daniel Carter stood amidst all that noise, holding a cup of hot coffee, his eyes as calm as a lake in the morning. He wasn't trying to impress, wasn't looking for attention. A gray hoodie, dark jeans, and a pair of slightly worn white sneakers. At a glance, no one would guess that this was the founder of Horizon Lux, a luggage brand that is about to sign an 8-year sponsorship deal with Eurosky Airlines. But Daniel was used to it. For him, simplicity was not a disguise. It was a way for him to remind himself that no matter where he stood in the business world, dignity was something he had to maintain from within. As he stepped off the bus at LAX this morning, he told himself that this trip would be a smooth one. The deal in Zurich was more than just a contract. It was a milestone that could catapult Horizon Lux into the global spotlight. And the prototype suitcase, he was lugging a model never before seen, was the soul of the new project. The suitcase is light, refined with a luxurious matte carbon fiber finish. No logos, no eye-catching colors, just the silence of perfect design. Daniel took a deep breath. The salty sea air mixed with the scent of freshly roasted coffee made him feel comfortable. He slowly walked into the check-in area. On the way, someone occasionally walked by, causing the coffee in his cup to sway slightly, as if the whole world was drifting away, while he remained in a quiet moment. The strange thing was, in that silence he heard his mother's voice echoing years ago. "Don't let anyone decide your worth, Daniel. People see you with their eyes, not with the truth." He smiled. Every time he thought of his mother, his heart softened a little. He lined up in the first-class section of Eurosky 721. The people around him wore expensive suits, diamond watches, and shiny shoes. He stood out because he was so ordinary. But ordinary was what he had chosen. A middle-aged man standing in front of him turned around, glanced at the suitcase and the clothes he was wearing, then nodded politely. "Morning." Daniel replied with a polite smile. "Morning, sir." The atmosphere was so peaceful that it was hard to imagine that just a few minutes later, a small, very small eye roll would change the whole journey, and even change an entire service industry. The check-in clerk smiled when he saw the name on the ticket. "Good morning, Mr. Carter. Have a wonderful flight to Zurich." Daniel nodded, thanked him, and then entered the security area. Everything went as normal as on hundreds of previous flights. Shoes were removed, laptops were left alone, and suitcases were placed on the conveyor belt. But today Daniel had a strange feeling, as if something was waiting for him behind the boarding gate. A premonition that wasn't necessarily bad, but enough to make his heart beat half a beat slower. He arrived at the boarding gate nearly 40 minutes early. Sitting in a window seat, he watched the planes parked on the runway. Eurosky planes always wore an elegant silver blue, a color that made him think of professionalism of early morning Europe. On the laptop screen, the last presentation slide was still open. Horizon Lux X Eurosky, redefining global travel. Daniel read each word again, not to check for errors, but to remind himself that any problems today, if any, must not distract him. Life only gives you a few real chances. And this is your chance. A female voice called the boarding group over the loudspeaker. Daniel stood up, put away his laptop, pulled his suitcase, and walked into the first-class line. The road ahead seemed straight. Little did he know, he was about to embark on the most rocky stretch of road in months. Daniel Carter always had a very calm exterior. A calm that those who first met him took for shyness or natural quiet. But the truth was different. Daniel's calm was the result of years of learning to stand firm in the wind. On mornings like today, when he walked through the shiny glass doors of LAX, the familiar feeling returned. The early morning sunlight shone on his face, dyeing it a soft yellow. No one knew how many times his heart had clenched beneath that calm demeanor for things that weren't his fault. Daniel was born in Atlanta, a working-class neighborhood where children's laughter mingled with honking cars, where mothers stood on porches calling their children in for dinner, where the smell of pastries wafting from the little shop down the street could make the day bearable. But it was also where little Daniel first learned that he wasn't seen as a child, but as a problem. He clearly remembered the first time he was followed by a mall security guard when he was 15 years old, just because he was wearing a loose hoodie and holding a bottle of soda in his hand. He just wanted to find a birthday present for his mother. But instead he was met with fear, a fear that made his steps tremble a little that day. At home, Daniel was silent for a long time. His mother, Linda Carter, put her hand on his shoulder. Her voice was soft. "Daniel, there are eyes that don't see you the way you deserve. But don't let them define who you are." That quote follows Daniel to this day every time he stands before a room full of people in suits. It follows him in big meetings, in multi-million-dollar contracts, and even in the smallest moments like this morning, when he placed the prototype suitcase next to his seat at the boarding gate. This is what Daniel does. He started Horizon Lux from scratch in a cramped garage. He had a simple thought. That luggage is more than just an item. It is a companion. It tells the story of how we live, travel, and grow. He spent 4 years researching materials, design, and weight. Together with a team of young engineers, they created suitcases that were light, durable, and sophisticated enough to make any traveler feel respected. When the first model was offered to be licensed by a major brand, Daniel refused. He wanted to build something that belonged to him, carrying the spirit of those who were underestimated, but refused to stand still. And thus, Horizon Lux was born. Each product sold each compliment from customers. Each article about the brand helped Daniel open the door to major airlines. And this time, Eurosky Airlines wanted to go further. They wanted Horizon Lux to become a strategic partner, co-sponsoring the luxury cabins for 8 years. For Daniel, it's more than just success. It's proof that people who were once looked down upon can still create something that the world can look back at. This morning, as he sat in the terminal watching the planes on the runway, he felt more peaceful than usual. But beneath that peace was tension. Not because of the presentation, not because of the contract, but because of a very small, very human worry. Will everything go smoothly? Will he be prepared? Will his prototype suitcase, his precious brainchild, make it through the flight? Daniel took a sip of coffee, the heat spreading in his mouth, helping him to stay awake. He thought of his father. He died when Daniel was 20. He always said, "You are strong not when you scream. You are strong when you don't lose yourself." Daniel thought he had done some of that. But life's lessons never stop. When the first-class group was called for boarding, Daniel left his seat and dragged his suitcase to door 47B. The line of people moved slowly, the sound of shoes clicking lightly on the floor. Up close, everyone could see the tiredness hidden in their faces. Some were on business trips, some were visiting relatives, some were looking for a new start. Daniel is no different. He is just a man with small worries and a long day ahead of him. But when he entered the cabin and took his seat in first class 3A, he felt something slightly off the normal axis, a very slight premonition. Maybe it was the gaze of the man in seat 3B looking at him and then quickly looking away. Maybe it was the strange silence in the cabin. Or maybe it was the woman standing by the aisle, her eyes sharp as knives aimed straight at his suitcase. Melissa Hart, chief stewardess of first class on Eurosky Flight 721. In that brief moment, Daniel had no idea what was going on. He only felt the atmosphere change like the wind picking up. It was a subtle shift, but enough for someone with strong intuition like him to notice. He put down his suitcase, preparing to put it in the luggage compartment, and just then Melissa's voice rang out sharp and cold as glass. "Sir, that bag doesn't belong up there." The syllables fell across the cabin like metal drops. No one said anything, but a few unfamiliar glances turned. Daniel stood still, his hands holding the suitcase. There was a hint of surprise in his deep brown eyes, but no anger. It wasn't that he was used to being treated that way. It was that he was so used to feeling judged before being heard. He took a breath. The journey had not yet begun, but adversity was knocking gently at the door. And Daniel understood that sometimes destiny chooses to start with the smallest moments. No one in the first-class cabin that day knew that just one seemingly innocuous sentence would be enough to shake up the entire flight, the entire system, and all the things Daniel Carter always tried to keep in his heart. As Daniel placed his hand on the armrest of seat 3A, he heard light but firm footsteps behind him. Melissa Hart, the chief flight attendant, was approaching, her face serious, her lips pressed into a straight line. To many, this was just a sign of professionalism. But to Daniel, who had observed countless types of eyes in his life, he immediately recognized this was a look for something out of place. And that out-of-place thing is you. The moment he lifted the Horizon Lux's suitcase to his chest, Melissa spoke up, her voice even but loud enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Sir, that bag doesn't belong up there." Not loud, not rude, but the tone was like a door slammed in someone's face. Daniel stopped. He turned his head slightly toward Melissa, not to confront her, just to see if he had misunderstood. But her eyes said it all. A familiar look, evaluating, classifying, placing him in a category she thought she had long understood. Daniel kept his breathing slow. In moments like these, he always remembered his father's words. When someone looks wrong, don't rush to correct others. First, straighten your back. He tried to keep his voice light as usual. "Ma'am, this suitcase fits in the overhead bin of international flights. It will only take me a second to put it in." Melissa shook her head before he finished his sentence. "No, sir. It's oversized. Please check it with the gate agent next time." A few nearby passengers glanced over, trying to appear unconcerned, but actually watching very clearly. Daniel could feel them watching to see what his reaction would be. He didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Not this morning, not with his mind preoccupied with an important meeting in Zurich. He spoke slowly so as not to be lost in the noise of the cabin. "I guarantee this suitcase will fit in this Airbus standard overhead bin." Melissa crossed her arms, a small gesture, but it carried a whiff of defiance. "Sir, I've done this job for 15 years. I know what fits." The sentence is not grammatically incorrect, but it is used incorrectly. A form of truth that is not completely true, but said with an absolutely true attitude. Daniel felt as if a thin string in his heart had just made a small click sound. It wasn't painful, just a mistimed beat. The suitcase in his hand felt a little heavier, not because of the weight, but because of the meaning. Before he could answer, a gentle hand was placed on his shoulder. It was Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, the old woman who had stood near him when boarding. Her voice was as low and soft as an old woolen scarf. "Let him try, dear. You might be surprised." Melissa turned. She smiled politely, but her eyes weren't smiling. "Ma'am, I appreciate your concern, but we have regulations." Daniel caught a glimpse of Mrs. Pierce's hand trembling slightly at the gentle but harsh rejection. He didn't want this woman to suffer because of him. "It's okay," he whispered to her. Then back to Melissa. "Let me try it on. If it doesn't fit, I'll take it down and check it in myself." Daniel tried to keep things as normal as possible, but Melissa didn't want to end it that easily. She took a step forward, blocking his path. "Sir, I said no." Those 3 words made the cabin space skip a beat. A man in seat 3B turned his head slightly to look at his phone, trying to look busy. A woman in row 2 leaned slightly. A very small moment of silence fell, but enough to leave a bitter taste. Daniel didn't want to argue in front of others. He put his suitcase on the floor next to the chair. He took a deep breath, then spoke in a voice so calm it made him feel a little tired. "If you have any doubts, you can call the gate agent or purser to confirm. I'm willing to wait." Melissa blinked. She didn't think he would go that far for a suitcase, but more importantly, she didn't think this man in the hoodie would dare to defend his point of view so calmly. She turned away, not answering him, but her voice rang out clearly to another flight attendant. "Get me the purser." Mrs. Pierce let out a small breath as if she had just seen an old play being performed. She looked at Daniel, her soft brown eyes filled with understanding. "You did the right thing," she whispered. Daniel bowed his head in thanks. He said nothing more. Something quiet stirred inside him. It wasn't anger. Anger was never his true emotion in situations like this. It's the tiredness. The tiredness of explaining yourself in situations where no one else needs to. He sat down in seat 3A, his hands clasped together in his lap. The suitcase stood beside his feet. Quiet, neat, the same perfect design he was proud of. But at this moment, it becomes a symbol of challenge. A minute or so later, the purser arrived. A woman with gray hair and a calm expression. She had been in the business too long to be affected by personal feelings. "Good morning, sir," she said. "I hear there is a problem with the size of your luggage." Daniel stood up and replied with due respect, "Yes, my suitcase meets international standards. I'd like to try putting it in the overhead bin." Purser nodded. "Of course." A simple sentence, but it made the tense atmosphere sink a beat. She turned to Melissa. "Let him try." And for the first time since boarding the plane, Daniel saw the obvious annoyance in Melissa's eyes, no longer hidden behind the service smile. Daniel lifted the suitcase. His movements were slow, unhurried, unshowy. He put the suitcase in the luggage compartment. It slides in, smoothly, cleanly, no creaking, no squeezing, no turning, as if the suitcase was meant to be in that exact position. Purser said softly, "Perfect fit." Mrs. Pierce smiled. It was a small smile, but warm enough to cut through the chill in the cabin. As for Melissa, Daniel didn't look at her, but he heard the sharp breath in her throat, heard the tension in her silence, heard the slight crack of something, maybe overconfidence, maybe prejudice, or maybe both. But Daniel was not happy, not victorious, not gloating, because I know this is just the beginning. And deep down, he didn't want this flight to be a war. He just wanted to get to Zurich, present his plan, sign the contract, and go home. He just wanted today to be a normal day. But fate, it seems, does not like the ordinary. Melissa turned away without a word. And Daniel sensed, from now on, he would not be treated like the others in the cabin. A very gentle wind in his heart whispered, "Calm down. You have been through more than this." He sat down in his seat. The first-class cabin was still lit with a soft yellow light. But somewhere the color had changed, and things are about to take a new turn. The moment Daniel's suitcase slid perfectly into the overhead bin, not only Purser Brenda but also several nearby passengers nodded slightly. Something obvious and logical had just been proven. It was the kind of truth that could not be disputed. But for Melissa Hart, that truth didn't end the matter. It opened another crack, a deeper one. Daniel saw it not in her actions but in the silence. A silence that was a little stiff, like someone forced to swallow something they didn't want to. Brenda checked one last time, then turned to Daniel. "Thank you for your patience, sir. Everything is fine." Daniel nodded slightly. "Thank you for your support." His voice was calm. And because it was so calm, it made the atmosphere heavier. When Brenda left, Melissa stood still for a few seconds. Her hand gripped the top of the drink cart as if it could steady her from the undertow rising inside her. Then she turned back to look at Daniel. The look was no longer hurried or angry. It was cold. A coldness that spoke not of professionalism, but of a determination to remember. Daniel knew it from afar even before the eyes met his. Not because he could guess Melissa's thoughts, but because he was used to that kind of look. A look that said, "I don't like being wronged by you." A look of someone used to being in a position of judgment. Not the first time, not the last time, but every time like that, Daniel felt somewhere in his heart a small vein drying up a little. Daniel sat down in seat 3A and pulled up his seatbelt. The first-class cabin began to settle. The lights dimmed, softened. The passengers around him began to get busy with their lives, opening laptops, reading newspapers, texting, adjusting their jackets. No one was looking at Daniel anymore. But he could clearly feel a gaze still following him. Melissa glided down the aisle. One step, two. When she reached Daniel's chair, she didn't stop, but she changed her pace ever so slightly. A considerate walk. Daniel didn't react. He didn't want to make a big deal out of a small matter. But deep down, he knew this wasn't the end. The engines began to roar as the plane prepared to taxi. From the window, Daniel could see streaks of light stretching along the runway, as if each lamppost was a small part of the memories of the passengers about to leave this earth. He closed his eyes for a second. Just a second to wonder, why do I still have to go through this, at my age, in this position, when I've tried to do everything right, not complaining, just a question lingering in my mind. As the plane started to move, Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, the woman in the aisle, leaned her head toward him. "Are you okay?" Daniel opened his eyes. Her smile lightened the mood a bit. "I'm fine," Daniel replied, his voice low but clear. "Don't let it get to you," she said softly, as if speaking to a grandchild rather than a successful businessman. "People react the way they're used to, but the way you keep your cool, that's strength." Daniel felt like a thin layer of mist covered his heart. Warm, but sad. He turned to the window, watching the sky close in. "Actually, I just wanted a normal flight, Grandma." She smiled. "Sometimes the ordinary is the hardest thing." The remark was so fitting that Daniel felt his heart clench. But he didn't want to carry heavy emotions on the flight. He nodded at her, as if to remind himself to keep his balance. About half an hour after takeoff, beverage service began. Melissa wheeled the cart in front of Daniel. She served the man in seat 3B, then seat 2A, then 2B. She spoke to them in a much softer voice than before. But as she approached Daniel, she didn't look at him, didn't stop, didn't ask for an order, just walked past. A small act. Many people might not notice, but Daniel did. He watched, said nothing, asked for no explanation, asked for no service. "Mrs. Pierce looked at the scene and sighed. "You see," she said softly, "some people just need a very small reason to act differently." Daniel smiled slightly, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I know, Grandma." But in his heart it was not that easy. When the meal was served, Melissa returned with the food cart. She placed the tray on Daniel's table a little too forcefully, not intentionally to cause trouble, but just to show off. The water in the glass shook. A few drops splashed out, wetting the napkin on the tray. Melissa didn't apologize, didn't look at Daniel, just said one short word, "Here." Mrs. Pierce looked at her, her eyes sharp, but she said nothing. Daniel said thank you, but Melissa did not reply. The discreet door of the first-class cabin suddenly became a suffocating space. Daniel stopped after a few bites. Not because the food wasn't tasty, but because his thoughts started to drag him back to old memories. Moments where other people's small actions were enough to stir up big emotions in his heart. He wondered, why does this happen at 34? With the responsibilities I have, with all these years of trying to keep my cool. Daniel didn't want to feel tired, but his body felt tired. He closed his eyes, then opened them. In that moment he saw the future. A day at work in Zurich, a big deal, a dream of many years. I try to keep everything under control. I have to keep myself. About 30 minutes later he pressed the flight attendant call button to ask for more tissues. The light came on. For a long moment no one came. Then Melissa herself walked in, stiff, face expressionless. Daniel said softly, "Can I have some more tissues, please?" Melissa placed the napkin on his desk quickly and decisively, as if wanting to touch as little as possible. "Here." She turned away immediately. Without lingering for a second, Daniel put his hand on the towel and realized he was tired. Not physically, mentally. And sometimes it's the little things that tire a person the most. But Daniel didn't know that. Those little things were quietly leading him to a moment that would change his life, the airline and the entire service industry. A moment is coming, very close. As soon as this plane hits the ground, the first-class cabin was bathed in a soft yellow light. It was usually a relaxing light, but for Daniel Carter it felt like the light in an interrogation room. Everything was so quiet that he could hear the sound of a spoon clinking against a porcelain bowl in the seat in front of him, the shifting of shoes and the steady hum of an engine behind him. Those small sounds made the coldness between him and Melissa Hart even more obvious. After the tray of food was brought to him with a cold, colorless look, Daniel tried to concentrate on his meal, but he could only eat a few spoonfuls before stopping. Not because he was hungry, not because the food was not delicious, but because he felt that every time Melissa passed by, the air around him froze a little, a tension familiar to anyone accustomed to dealing with discrimination. No one spoke, no one cursed. But the coldness was enough to drain the warmth from a person's heart. About 20 minutes later, people started calling for refills. Melissa walked through row 2, asking each person a question in a sweeter voice than she had when she spoke to Daniel. It was a sharp, slightly too natural sweetness, but it succeeded in making the other passengers think she was doing her job well. Then she approached seat 3B. "Can I get you anything else, sir?" The man in seat 3B smiled. "Whiskey on the rocks, please." Melissa nodded. A gentle first-class gesture. Then she turned to Daniel, but passed by as if he didn't exist. Daniel pressed the call button. He didn't make a big deal out of it, nor did he call in an annoyed tone. He pressed the button just once, lightly, as was the habit of someone who tried to keep his emotions in check. The light came on. Melissa stopped, glanced at him, and instead of moving forward, she kept pushing, as if the light was somewhere behind her, unrelated to her. Mrs. Eleanor Pierce looked on, her brows furrowed. "She didn't stop when you called?" she asked, her voice half surprised and half indignant. Daniel just smiled slightly. She probably didn't see. But Daniel knew all too well. Melissa saw. The way she glanced at the indicator and then looked away said it all. And Mrs. Pierce knew it too. She looked at Daniel for a long time. It was a sad but warm look, as if she had witnessed what she had experienced as a young white woman struggling with gender bias, a bias as faint and persistent as fog. "You don't have to suffer this," she whispered. Daniel responded with a very deep breath. "I've been used to it since I was little, Grandma." That's not a sad quote. Just the saying of someone who has been through enough to know that some things don't change as easily as we think. About 10 minutes later, Purser Brenda walked by and saw the call light was on. She stopped. "Do you need anything, Mr. Carter?" Daniel was about to say it was okay, but Mrs. Pierce was quicker. He rang the bell for a long time, but no one came. Brenda looked over at Melissa, who was standing near the kitchen behind her. Brenda's eyes sharpened ever so slightly. Daniel tried to defend himself. I just want some more water. It's no big deal. Brenda nodded, poured him water, then bowed slightly as if to apologize. If there is any inconvenience, please let me know. Once again, Daniel felt the difference between a person who serves with heart and a person who serves with prejudice. The plane continued to stabilize at 36,000 feet. The cabin lights were dimmed to allow passengers to rest. Daniel opened his laptop to work. But just a few minutes later, as he was scrolling through slide 12 of the plan, a figure stopped right next to him. Melissa. She said nothing, didn't ask, didn't look at him. She just reached for the empty tray in front of him. Without a word of permission, the tray lightly hit Daniel's laptop. It was a small impact, but enough to make the screen vibrate. Melissa said, "Oops, just one word, not sincere, not sorry." Daniel closed his laptop. He didn't want to risk the machine containing the multi-million-dollar deal. "It's okay," he said. His voice did not tremble, but his heart was a little tired. A little later, when the cabin was winding down for the night, another flight attendant handed out pillows and blankets. This one, a young woman named Marie, gently placed the pillow on Daniel's seat. "Do you need another blanket?" Daniel thanked him. This time his voice was softer than usual, as if he were trying to retain some remaining warmth. Marie smiled and bowed. Daniel watched, feeling a strange sense of gratitude. In moments of disrespect, a small act of kindness often carries more strength than large words of comfort. The background hum of the plane's engines mingled with the steady breathing of the passengers in the cabin. Daniel sat up straight, but his mind began to drift back to the years when he had worked twice as hard just to be seen as normal. He remembered meetings where he was mistaken for an assistant instead of the CEO. He remembered having to introduce himself twice to make people believe he was the head of a multi-million-dollar company. He remembered the critical looks when he entered a luxury hotel. It's funny, you can negotiate contracts with major corporations. You can design products that wow the industry. You can create jobs for over 300 people, but just one flight attendant with a prejudiced look, he felt like he was pulled back to the age of 15. Mrs. Pierce placed a gentle hand on his arm, bringing him back to reality. "Daniel," she whispered, "you are not alone. You are not imagining this. And you are not wrong." Daniel turned. In those old eyes he saw something that not everyone could give recognition. "Thanks," Daniel said. "I'm just tired." A rare confession. "You're tired of having to put up with something that shouldn't be there," Mrs. Pierce added. "But you face it beautifully." Daniel bowed his head, said nothing, clenched his fists a little to regain his composure. A little over an hour later, the cabin was dimmed for refreshments. Melissa returned. This time she didn't ignore Daniel, but her treatment was still as cold as ever. "Snack?" she asked, not looking at him. Daniel replied softly, "Give me a packet of seeds." Melissa set it down on his desk with a little force. Enough to be noticed, enough for Daniel to see. No one said anything, no one stood up to defend him. No one knew that a tiny pain had just rippled through his heart. But Mrs. Pierce kept looking. She was the only one who recorded every moment. When the cabin fell silent again, Daniel opened his laptop, put his hands on the keyboard. But instead of working, he opened a new file. He began to write 9:12 p.m. Flight attendant refused to serve drinks. 9:28 p.m. Food tray slammed down, water spilled on the table. 9:45 p.m. Flight attendant call light is ignored. Not to complain, not because he was angry, but because he wanted clear evidence of something bigger than himself. One thing you know can change the way an airline treats passengers like you. And as he marked the last line of that report, little did he know that an even bigger moment was coming, a moment that would bring Melissa Hart and Eurosky Airlines face to face with the inevitable truth. The Eurosky cabin was bathed in a soft blue light like a lake at night. Everyone thought it was time to rest, time to relax. But for Daniel Carter, it was moments like these that made people easily face their deepest selves. He sat still, his hands on the keyboard, but he didn't type another word. The window beside him reflected his face, calm, mature, with a weary look in his eyes. Not because of the long flight, but because he was entering a realm of emotions he rarely allowed himself to reach. As a child, when Daniel was about 13, his mother, Linda Carter, said something that he didn't fully understand at the time. She said, "There are pains not big enough to knock you down, but sharp enough to cut into you every day." Today, when Melissa ignored him when the tray was slammed down, when her eyes swept over him as if he were not worth serving, Daniel felt those words again. Not big, not noisy, not dangerous, but sharp, very sharp. And it is that kind of silent hurt that wears people down over the years. Daniel is not a hot-tempered person. He has been through enough to know that anger does not make him stronger, and it does not help others understand him better. But tonight, amidst the pitch-black sky outside the window, he felt a slight flutter in his heart, a feeling of weariness that he rarely admitted. He remembered his first day of college. When he walked into his freshman class, the professor looked around the room and joked that he thought Daniel was a basketball scholarship player. The class laughed. Daniel didn't laugh. No one meant anything bad. But it was these jokes that pushed him into a cycle of thinking, why do I have to prove so much? Why am I not automatically considered a good student, an intelligent person, a capable person, but have to prove myself twice? It was the first time he learned to calm down, not react, not get angry, just try to do better. But that constant trying created a shell that people mistook for calm. On the plane, as the cabin gradually fell silent, Daniel leaned his head back against the seat. He thought he would fall asleep, but his mind kept turning over layers of memories like pages of an old notebook. He remembers the first time he stood before a big investor. During the presentation, they kept asking him, "You mean you're the actual CEO, not a sales rep? Why did the company let you stand and present? We want to meet the founder, not the representative." He smiled and said softly, "Yes, I am the founder." But that night when he got home, he sat in his car for a long time without turning it off. It was a rare occasion when he felt himself reaching the edge of self-doubt. Is it because I'm not good enough? Or is it because I'm someone people don't want to believe? He learned to pick himself up, but those questions still left scars. The sound of the plane's engine was as light as a fan, but it was enough to bring Daniel back to the present. He opened his eyes and looked across the aisle. Melissa was standing there talking quietly with another flight attendant. She didn't look at him, but he could feel her uneasy energy, an energy that felt like stinging when one's pride was touched. He didn't know why. Maybe it was because he'd made her wrong in front of the other passengers. Maybe it was because she wasn't used to being contradicted. Or maybe, and he didn't want to think about it, it was because she'd been looking at him through the same lens since he'd boarded the plane. And the most painful thing wasn't that she looked at him like that. It was that it no longer surprised him. Mrs. Eleanor Pierce leaned toward him. Her voice was small, but it carried the empathy that only the experienced possess. "Daniel, are you okay?" He nodded. "I'm fine. I was thinking about something." "Old stories." "Yes, Mrs." Pierce looked at him a long time, as if to say with her eyes that she understood more than he told her. "Do you know what makes me the strongest?" she asked. Daniel smiled, shaking his head slightly. "It's not about overcoming everything," she said. "It's about overcoming and still being kind." Daniel looked at her. A warmth spread gently in his chest. "You kept it," she added, without realizing it. He didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to laugh, part of him wanted to sigh, and a very small part of him wanted to cry. Not because I'm weak, but because sometimes just having someone see the wounds I've been hiding is enough to soften my heart. Daniel opened his laptop. Not to work, but to look at the opening slide of his presentation, Horizon Lux X Eurosky, redefining travel with respect. He stared at the word respect. Respect. The simplest word in the world, a word that everyone deserves, a word that sometimes becomes a luxury. He wondered, when he presented it to Eurosky's board tomorrow, would they understand that this partnership was not just a business strategy, but also an opportunity for the airline to change the way it treated passengers like him? A very light feeling passed through Daniel's heart. The feeling of wanting to do something bigger, not for revenge, but to prevent others from experiencing what he was feeling tonight. Melissa's footsteps approached. Daniel looked down the aisle. She stopped right next to his chair, the first time in hours. "Cabin lights will be dimmed again in 10 minutes, she said. Her voice was announcement-like, no emotion, no eye contact. Daniel nodded. "Thank you." Melissa did not respond. She turned away. But before she left the driveway, she caught a glimpse of Daniel's reflection in the window. It was a quick glance, but there was something strange in it. No more contempt. No more irritation. But, confused, it was as if she felt there was something about this man that wasn't what she had originally thought. As if there was something that made her pause for half a second. Daniel noticed the change, but he didn't care. He didn't expect Melissa to like him. He just wanted her to understand that respect, even the smallest thing, could save someone's day. As the cabin lights dimmed, Daniel leaned back in his chair. A fatigue spread through his body, but with it, a simmering determination. He knew that tonight, Melissa didn't know who he was. She didn't know that the suitcase she looked down on was a prototype for the company that was about to sign a partnership with Eurosky. She didn't know that this black man in a hoodie was the CEO of the brand that would be on every advertising poster for the company for the next 2 years. But Daniel doesn't want to use his status to force anyone to change. What he wanted was for the truth to reveal itself. And when that happened, no one, not even Melissa, could deny the way she had treated him during this flight. Daniel closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to prepare for the next chapter that was coming, one he didn't seek, but had to face. Though the cabin was silent, something was not standing still. That was the feeling in Daniel's heart, a weariness, but also a hope, a wound, but also an opportunity. And he had no idea that ahead, as soon as the plane landed, his life would take a completely different turn. A direction that starts with the smallest things and ends with the biggest changes. There was a special kind of silence on planes at night, not complete silence, but the silence of people suspended between heaven and earth, temporarily removed from the chaos on the ground. Daniel Carter leaned his head back on the seat, eyes closed but not asleep. In the first-class cabin, a soft blue mist hung over the cabin. Eleanor Pierce dozed off. A few other passengers watched a movie on headphones. There was only Daniel, and something was changing that he didn't realize. Melissa Hart stood at the front of the plane, arms crossed, trying to appear calm, but inside she was not okay. Her mood had been between irritation and confusion since takeoff. She doesn't like being wrong. She especially doesn't like being proven wrong in front of other passengers. But there was something else that made her more uneasy. She didn't understand how the man in seat 3A could remain so calm, not arguing, not speaking rudely, not trying to embarrass her. He just stood there like a rock. And that only made Melissa more confused. During her 15 years as a flight attendant, she had met all kinds of passengers, arrogant, grumpy, polite, friendly. But the calm, steady type like Daniel, she rarely met. It made her feel like her initial assessment of him was no longer solid. Around midnight, with the cabin bathed in dim light, Daniel opened his laptop and resumed work. He tilted the screen toward him, but part of it still shone out. He was adjusting the slides for the Eurosky board meeting the following morning in Zurich. No one noticed, except one person. Melissa walked by, not to serve, but to check the cabin again. When she reached Daniel's seat, she glanced over. Just a quick glance. A habit of someone who watched everything in the cabin. But that glance made her world stop. The laptop screen displayed a large slide. Horizon Luxx Euroski, Strategic Partnership Presentation. Next to that line of text was a photo. A portrait of the CEO of Horizon Luxx. And that face. It was the man sitting in seat 3A. The man she had yelled at, the man she had passed over for service, the man she had looked down on because he was wearing a hoodie. Melissa stood still for half a second. It felt like someone had turned off all the sounds in the cabin. She looked back at the screen, at Daniel's face, at the screen again. No way. She knew Horizon Luxx. Who in the airline industry didn't? The luggage company was poised to become Eurosky's biggest partner this decade. Its CEO was praised in the press for his innovation and humane leadership. She had read about him, but she never imagined he would be sitting right in front of her, wearing a hoodie. Melissa felt the blood drain from her face within 3 seconds. Then her heart beat so hard she could hear it. She took a small step back. A dizziness seemed to block her chest. Meanwhile, Daniel was still working. He had no idea that the screen had just changed someone else's life. He just edited the slide, pulling back the tagline, "Travel with Dignity." The words he wrote were like a mirror reflecting the situation he was going through right now. Melissa saw the words, and it was like a stab to the heart. Dignity, respect, the thing she had lacked the most for the past several hours. Unable to contain herself any longer, Melissa swallowed. Her chest felt tight, as if someone were trying to twist it. She should have treated this guest with the utmost respect. She should have recognized that he was doing important work. She should have treated him fairly even if she didn't know who he was. But she did the opposite, exactly the opposite. Not because he was wrong, but because she judged him based on his hoodie and skin color. Melissa took another step back. Her hands were shaking slightly. She placed her hands on the front of the chair to keep her balance. This embarrassment wasn't like ordinary shame, it was fear. Fear that what she'd done would have consequences. Not because of Daniel's power, but because of what it said about her. She tried to take a deep breath, but it was a shaky breath. She turned to leave, but her unsteady footing caused the cart to shake slightly. Melissa leaned back in her seat. A young flight attendant saw that and asked quietly, "Melissa, are you okay?" She shook her head quickly. I'm fine." But her voice didn't sound like a okay person at all. Melissa walked toward the galley. She stood behind the curtain, her hands gripping the edge of the cold steel counter. Sweat beaded her palms despite the cool cabin. She closed her eyes. In her mind, every moment replayed the "that bag doesn't belong up there." The disdainful glance as Daniel explained. The tray she slammed down on his desk. The half-mocking, half-irresponsible "oops." The deliberate ignoring of his call sign. It all came back like a movie. And now Melissa knows exactly who she did that to. The CEO of the company is about to sign a multi-million-dollar contract with her company. She stepped back, placing her hands on the galley mirror. Her face reflected in the mirror paled visibly. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice unsteady. In the cabin, Daniel continued working. He typed a few notes, unaware that just a few feet behind him, the person who had been making him tired all flight was standing inside the galley, trembling as he faced himself. Every so often, Daniel rubbed his eyes. He imagined how stressful tomorrow morning would be. The slides he prepared had to be perfect, because this was more than a contract. This was a new direction for Horizon Luxx. He didn't know. This calmness made Melissa even more confused. Melissa caught her breath and pulled the galley curtain open a little. She looked toward seat 3A. Daniel was hunched over, concentrating. The light from his laptop screen fell on his face, not arrogant, not showing off, not pretending to know who you are. Just working, just trying to keep a normal day. Normal. That embarrassed Melissa more than the fact that he was the CEO. Part of her wanted to run over and apologize immediately. Another part was afraid Daniel would look at her the way she had looked at him at first, with contempt. As she stood looking through the curtain, Mrs. Eleanor Pierce, who was sitting nearby, suddenly opened her eyes. She saw Melissa's shadow peeking out. Her eyes met Melissa's. No words needed to be spoken. Melissa knew from that look Mrs. Pierce had seen it all, witnessed it all, and she disagreed. Melissa bowed her head slightly and let the curtain fall. For the first time in her 15 years as a flight attendant, she felt like she had let down the self-image she had always been so proud of. She told herself, I have to apologize. Whether he forgives me or not, I still have to apologize. But she had not yet stepped out, because just then the cabin speaker rang out with Purser Brenda's voice. Ladies and gentlemen, we will begin our initial descent shortly. Melissa's head jerked up. She looked at her watch. Only 40 minutes to landing, 40 minutes before Daniel meets the Eurosky leadership, 40 minutes before the truth about Daniel's identity can spread through the internal system. She felt time was running faster than her heartbeat. In the cabin, Daniel closed his laptop, not because he was tired, but because he wanted to take a few minutes to breathe, to prepare himself for the long day ahead. Little did he know that behind the galley curtain, a small storm was brewing, and Melissa Hart, who hurt him silently all flight, just discovered a truth that could change her life forever, a truth that just needs a moment more to come to light. About 30 minutes before the plane descended, the cabin was still bathed in a dim blue light. Passengers were busy packing up, some reclining their seats, others turning off the entertainment screens. As for Daniel Carter, he sat up straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees, his eyes looking out the window. Not because of the beautiful view, but because he was taking the last few minutes to reassure himself that tomorrow morning's meeting would go as planned. At 3,000 feet, he tried to regain the familiar sense of balance he had when entering important situations. But today, something was different. Not because of Melissa Hart, but because he understood what was happening on this flight was a microcosm of the larger challenges he had spent his life fighting. In the galley, Melissa stood still as a statue. Sweat trickled down her back. Her heart was pounding so fast she was afraid the passengers could hear it. She knew exactly what she had to do: apologize immediately. Whether Daniel forgave her or not, she had to speak. Not just because of his position, but because of what she realized when she saw that slide. She treated a nice person badly. She pulled back the curtain and stepped into the aisle with clenched fists. But as she approached seat 3A, her footsteps faltered. Daniel was still looking out the window, his face tilted, the light reflecting off his cheekbones, making him look strangely peaceful. A kind of peace that made Melissa feel even more guilty. She swallowed hard, then took a deep breath. Mr. Carter. Daniel turned his head, his eyes as calm as a still lake. Yes, his voice made Melissa shiver more. Not cold, not angry, just plain. But it was that simplicity that made her feel like she was standing naked before the truth. She took another breath. I want to apologize about earlier, about your suitcase. I was. Before she could finish, Daniel gently interrupted. It's okay, 3 words, as light as an eraser. But Melissa felt them as heavy as stone. She shook her head quickly. No, sir, I think I behaved badly. I shouldn't have. Daniel looked at her for a moment. It wasn't a reproachful look. It wasn't spiteful. But it made Melissa's breath catch. Then he said in a slow voice, I appreciate your apology. But really, I don't need your further explanation. That sentence made Melissa feel like a strong wind was blowing in her chest. There was no need for her to explain further. That sentence was like a mirror reflecting the naked truth. I don't want to continue this. I don't want to drag it out. I'm not trying to cause trouble. I just want it to be over. But that attitude made Melissa panic even more. She swallowed, her hands clasped behind her back. Mr. Carter, I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I just want you to know that I'm truly sorry. Daniel said nothing for a few seconds. He looked into her eyes. It wasn't a long look, but it was enough for Melissa to sense that he was considering something. Then he said softly, "I'm not mad at you, Melissa." His voice was low, deep, and warm, making the words hurt even more. She opened her mouth. "But I already," Daniel shook his head. "No need. I think everyone has bad days, and some things don't always reflect who we really are." Melissa's heart clenched. No one had ever spoken to her that way, especially not someone she had hurt. She tried to keep her voice. "If you need anything else, just call me." Daniel nodded slightly, not smiling but not cold either, a very neutral expression, very difficult to read. "Thank you." Melissa stood there for another half-second as if she wanted to say so many things, but her throat tightened. She bowed deeply, a bow that no longer held the pride of a long-time stewardess. "Thank you for listening." As Melissa turned away, her hands shook so much she almost dropped the small notebook. She returned to the galley, leaned against the wall, and closed her eyes. She had never felt such relief and pain. Not that Daniel didn't accept the apology, but that he accepted it graciously, and that made her feel even smaller. Daniel returned to his moment of silence, but his heart was not as calm as it appeared. He respected Melissa's attempt to apologize. He also knew that not everyone had the courage to face their mistakes, and she did. But that didn't erase the tired feeling that lingered throughout the flight. It didn't erase the memories of being misjudged because of his appearance. It didn't erase the questions that Daniel had spent his whole life trying to answer. A part of him, a very small part, is still hurt. But he didn't want to turn it into anger, because Daniel understood anger may flare up strongly, but it builds nothing. Only clarity and consistency do. Mrs. Eleanor Pierce opened her eyes from a nap. She turned to Daniel, catching a glimpse of Melissa walking hurriedly toward the galley. "Did she apologize?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded slowly. "Yes, then." Mrs. Pierce studied his face, then said, "You don't have to forgive right away. Forgiving too quickly can sometimes hurt you." Daniel was silent for a few seconds. Then he replied, "I'm not mad at you, Grandma. It's just, today hasn't been an easy day." Mrs. Pierce smiled, a very gentle smile. "You faced it beautifully. Sometimes that's enough." Daniel looked down at his hands. His fingers were shaking slightly. No one could see it but him. "I'm just afraid. If I say this in the meeting tomorrow, people will think I'm making a big deal out of nothing." Mrs. Pierce shook her head immediately. "No, Daniel. This is not a small matter. This is a matter of many people, a matter of culture, a matter of how people treat each other." Her voice was low but strong. "And you are the right person to say that." Daniel felt his heart warm a little when he heard that. Not much, but enough to lighten the heavy feeling. In the galley, Melissa stood crouched, trying to make herself smaller. She knew it wasn't over. If Daniel's identity was reported to the system, management could call her as soon as the plane landed. She wasn't afraid of being blamed. She was afraid of facing the truth that she had become the person she always claimed she wasn't. In the cabin, the loudspeaker announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our final descent. Please return to your seats and ensure your seat belts are securely fastened." Daniel took a deep breath. He knew the most important part of this trip had yet to begin. Because when the plane touches down, when the Eurosky representative comes to greet you at the gate, the truth will come out. And that meeting, just minutes after the doors opened, would leave not only Melissa but the entire flight crew stunned into silence. The ding sound that signaled the plane's landing was soft, but enough to awaken all of Daniel Carter's senses. He opened his eyes, took a deep breath, and felt the pressure of the flight drain from his chest as the plane's wheels touched the runway. Ahead, light from the still closed doors spilled into the passageway. A small light, but it contained a great truth. A truth that in a few minutes the entire first-class cabin, especially Melissa Hart, would not be able to deny. As the plane taxied to the gate, passengers turned on their phones, adjusted their shirts, and fixed their hair. Daniel remained seated. He was in no hurry. He did not want to jostle. He also did not want to be the center of attention. But he didn't know. In a few minutes, he would be standing in that exact spot, the center of attention that no one could ignore. Meanwhile, in the galley, Melissa stood upright, her hands clutching the edge of the locker. Though she tried to calm herself, she could feel her heart beating faster than the sound of the engine. She knew this moment would come. The moment Daniel stepped off the plane. The moment his true identity would be confirmed by the actions of those waiting at the terminal. She muttered in her head, "Is it possible that no one comes to pick you up? Is it possible that you are just a middle manager?" But immediately a voice inside her replied, "No, CEO is still CEO." A chill ran down her spine and down her arms. Purser Brenda opened the plane door. The light from the telescope poured into the cabin, bright and strong as reality. The front row passengers began to stand up and retrieve their luggage. "Mrs. Eleanor Pierce patted Daniel on the shoulder. "Go on, son. They will be waiting for you outside." Daniel smiled softly. "I'm not used to being greeted like that, Grandma. But this morning, I'll get used to it." Melissa walked to the door to greet the guests, as per protocol. Her palms were sweaty, but she tried to hide it by clasping her hands behind her back. The first passengers disembarked. Brenda smiled at each one. Melissa tried to keep her face calm, but then she saw something that made her legs give way. Right next to the jet bridge, standing solemnly as if waiting for a head of state, were three men in navy suits with Eurosky Airlines name tags pinned to their shirts. And in the midst of them, a tall man, luxurious silver hair, bright eyes. It was Richard Langford, CEO of Eurosky Airlines. Melissa knew him. Who in the company didn't? He was the one who rarely came to the gate to greet guests. Even for VIP guests, he only sent his assistant. But today, there he stood, in person, right at the door. Melissa felt her head pounding. No way. Richard Langford looked toward the cabin, his eyes expectant. He didn't open his mouth. He didn't look at his phone. He just stood there, as if he were expecting to see someone important. Melissa swallowed. He's waiting for Daniel Carter. A chill ran down her spine. All her suspicions suddenly became obvious. Passengers continued to disembark. Richard Langford smiled politely at them, but did not shake hands. He simply inclined his head. None of them were the person he was looking for. Melissa stood still. She felt her career future slipping through her fingers like a scarf in the wind. And then Daniel stood up. No rush. No trying to adjust my clothes. Just put on my backpack, grab my suitcase. The suitcase Melissa had said wasn't worthy of being in the overhead bin. He walked toward the door. Each step seemed slower because the cabin was dead silent. The whole cabin seemed to be waiting for something big. When Daniel appeared in the doorway, Richard Langford immediately stepped forward, smiling brightly. "Daniel, we've been waiting for you since the plane landed." He held out his hand. Daniel smiled and shook his hand. That handshake, with the airline CEO in front of the entire crew, right at the plane door, like a thunderbolt that ripped apart everything Melissa tried to deny. Brenda stood by the door, silent but eyes wide. Melissa couldn't breathe. Her chest felt tight. Richard turned to his assistant. "Prepare a car to take Mr. Carter straight to the VIP room, and inform the Zurich team that he will be at the meeting on time." "Yes, sir." Daniel bowed slightly politely. "Thank you for coming out to meet me. I didn't expect this." Richard laughed. "Eurosky's strategic partner deserves such a welcome." The first-class cabin at the back fell into complete silence. Only Melissa's heart was pounding. Richard turned back into the cabin and glanced at the crew. "Thank you everyone for your service today." He said that to all the flight attendants. But as soon as his eyes fell on Melissa, she felt like she was being seen through, not because he knew, but because she felt so ashamed that she didn't dare to raise her head. Daniel saw her standing by the door. He just nodded. Not hello, not forgiveness, just a simple nod. But Melissa felt it weigh as heavy as a rock in her heart. Richard signaled Daniel to go first. We have much to discuss, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Daniel turned to Brenda and smiled gratefully. Thank you for your assistance during the flight. Brenda bowed her head slightly, her face warm as if to say, I have seen the true you. Then Daniel dragged his suitcase, the suitcase Melissa had once underestimated, out of the plane. When Daniel and Richard were gone, the cabin remained silent for a long time. Melissa stood there, drained of all strength. Her lip trembled. She wanted to reach for the wall, but she held back, afraid Brenda would see her collapse. Brenda turned to look at Melissa. No words, but her eyes said it all. You know this doesn't end that simply. Melissa swallowed painfully. Brenda, Brenda interrupted, her voice soft but sharp. We will talk after the guests leave. She didn't threaten. She didn't yell. The way she spoke was even more frightening than yelling. Melissa bowed her head, not saying anything more, because she understood clearly no one can save her from the consequences this time. Not because Daniel is powerful, but because the way she treated a human being indefensible. In the moment the cabin was half empty, Mrs. Pierce stood up. She looked at Melissa, her eyes both sad and serious. Girl, it's not because he's the CEO, it's because he's a human. Remember that next time. Melissa couldn't answer. No words were enough. Only tears were threatening to fall, but she tried to hold them back because she knew the worst part wasn't the punishment that was coming. It was the fact that she herself had gotten herself into this position. The VIP room is located deep in the executive holding area of Eurosky Zurich. It is so quiet that even the sound of shoes hitting the floor can be heard clearly. Daniel Carter enters, followed by Richard Langford and his two assistants. In the spacious room with light-colored wood floors, every design is minimalist but sophisticated. A large glass panel looks out onto the runway where giant Airbuses are parked in line. Daniel sat down in the chair opposite the conference table. The light made his face look gentler and more calm than usual. Richard sat a short distance away from him, his hands clasped together like someone holding back many emotions. No one spoke at once. There was a thick silence. A peaceful, but heavy one. Finally Richard said, his voice low, Daniel, I'm sorry for what you went through on the flight this morning. Daniel shook his head slightly. You don't need to apologize on anyone's behalf. Richard replied immediately, not letting him finish his sentence. No, I have to apologize, because it happened on my plane, under the flag of the company I lead. The last syllable in his sentence was slightly prolonged, showing that he no longer maintained his CEO composure. Daniel looked down at the table, and when he looked up he said in a very low voice, I don't want to turn this into a scandal, but I'll tell everything as it happened. Richard nodded, his eyes serious. I want to hear it all. Daniel recounted. Every detail, every minute, nothing more, nothing less. He started with the suitcase Melissa said was too big to put in the overhead bin, the way she talked, the way she stood in front of him like he was trying to get around the rules. He told of the hasty glance of judgment, of the prejudiced shake of the head, of the moment when she rolled her eyes. A small action, but enough to reveal her true thoughts. Richard listened without interrupting, but his jawline tightened. When Daniel told the story of Melissa deliberately leaving him out while serving drinks, then calling him sir in a distant voice, while calling other passengers by their first names, Richard slowly placed both hands on the table, his face slightly bowed. The air in the room was heavy as lead. Richard raised his head and spoke slowly, word by word. I endured that for 8 hours. I'm used to it, Daniel replied lightly, as if it were a normal story. But it was that calmness that hurt Richard more than his complaints. He continued, it's not because I'm a CEO that I'm tired. It's because despite all the things I've accomplished, I still have to start the conversation in my head with a familiar question. He looked straight at Richard. How much do I have to endure today? The room fell into complete silence. Richard sat motionless. Not because he didn't know what to say, but because he was trying to swallow down some indescribable emotion. Anger, shame, guilt, all three mixed together. A few seconds later, he turned to the assistant beside him. Thomas, take notes. I want the entire TA 432 flight reviewed immediately. Every flight recorder, every crew report, every cabin camera, everything. The assistant immediately wrote it down, his face slightly pale. Richard continued, his voice low but sharp as steel, and I want to know why a flight attendant would dare to behave like that towards any passenger, especially a senior partner of the airline. Daniel shook his head slightly. Richard, I don't want punishment, I want change. Punishment is mine, Richard replied immediately. Change, that is ours. Daniel looked at him, his eyes softening. He saw that Richard was not trying to defend the company. Not justifying, not beating around the bush. That made him respect him more. Is there anything else I need to know? Richard asked. Daniel pursed his lips slightly, then replied, there is one thing more important than a suitcase, more than attitude, more than discrimination. He took a breath, hands on the table. It's that feeling of invisibility, the feeling of not belonging in a place you've paid to sit in. It's not an action, it's an atmosphere. Richard closed his eyes for a few seconds, then opened them. His eyes were slightly red. You don't deserve to go through that. No one does. Daniel smiled very lightly. I know. But we can't change the world. We can only change what we touch. Richard looked at him for a long time. And my firm is where I can tap into that. There was a long silence. Nothing tense, nothing heavy, just two men thinking about something bigger than this conversation itself. Daniel continued, his voice as if telling a carefully thought-out story. I want to propose a new cultural training program. Not some one-day workshop. I want something real, hands-on, real, tackling the things no one likes to face. Richard asked briefly. Program name? Daniel replied immediately because he had thought about it before. Elevate human dignity. Richard immediately looked at his assistant. Write it down and deploy it at the corporate level. Today, he added. Daniel was a little startled. You don't need to think more. Richard smiled. A smile not for the media but for the truth. Daniel, what you just said is enough. After more than half an hour, the meeting adjourned. The two assistants left the room to prepare the documents. Daniel and Richard remained. There was no longer a conference table between them. Just two men, each representing a pain and a hope. Richard said softly, Daniel, what I respect most about you isn't because you're the CEO. It's not because of the contract. It's because of how you keep your cool. Daniel chuckled. I'm calm not because I'm not angry, but because I know anger won't help. Richard looked at him carefully and said, do you know what hurts me the most? Daniel, wait, Richard said. It was when you told the story in a softer voice than I expected. It showed you had been through this too many times. Daniel did not reply. Because the truth did not need to be said again. Richard stood up, walked over to Daniel and put his hand on his shoulder. I promise, Eurosky will never let this happen again, and we will make your story the beginning of a big change. Daniel looked at him, his eyes deep and steady. If we do this right, this is no longer my story. It will be the story of every passenger who has ever felt small. Two people shake hands. A handshake is no longer a formality of cooperation. It is a commitment that carries the weight of something greater than profit, dignity, justice, and humanity. As Daniel left the conference room, the hallway seemed wider than usual, not because it was luxurious, but because a new space opened up in his heart where things that had been held back were finally spoken. And he knew a new chapter of the journey had just begun. Eurosky's internal investigation room is separate from the main office. There are no clear glass doors, no warm lighting, just gray walls and a cold that makes every mistake seem magnified. Melissa Hart sat motionless in the metal chair, her hands clasped together until they turned white. This was not the first time she had been called in for an internal investigation in her 11 years as a flight attendant, but never as terrifying as today. No one was chatting in the hallways. No colleagues texted her, "What's up?" Everyone was silent. It was so quiet that Melissa understood this was no ordinary examination. The door opened. 3 people walked in. Paul Hammond, Flight Services Director. Linda Farrow, Head of Human Resources. And lastly, Richard Langford, CEO of Eurosky Airlines. Melissa paled. The CEO had never personally entered an employee interrogation room. Richard sat down across from her. No smile, no nod. He just looked at her with a look that made Melissa feel the verdict was no longer in the future. It was sitting right in front of her. Linda began, her voice not loud but sharp. "Melissa, we will ask questions. You answer honestly. Everything can be checked by camera and the crew's testimony." Melissa swallowed. "Yes, I get it." Paul opened his laptop and read the minutes again. "We were told that you asked passenger Daniel Carter to check in his suitcase because it was too large. Is that correct?" Melissa blinked a few times. I think it's too big." Paul looked her straight in the eye. "The cabin camera measurements show the suitcase is perfectly compliant, and it fits in the overhead bin without any compression. Would you like to amend your statement?" Melissa fell silent. Her throat was dry. "I may have been hasty in my judgment." Richard tapped his hand on the table. "It's not haste, it's prejudice." Melissa bowed her head. Linda continued. "The witness in row 2C, Miss Eleanor Pierce, said she was disrespectful to Mr. Carter from the very first moment. Do you have any rebuttal?" Melissa clenched her fists. "No, I don't mean to be disrespectful. I'm just trying to keep to the rules." Paul turned to the next page of the minutes. "And what about the fact that you ignored Mr. Carter when he served you drinks, and when you were reminded you responded in a very unfriendly tone?" Melissa shook her head quickly. I didn't mean to skip it. I was just busy." Richard said immediately. "If you were busy, why were the other passengers served in order but Mr. Carter was ignored?" Melissa did not reply, not because she didn't want to, but because she knew that any word she said now would become a trap she tied herself to. Linda continued, her voice soft but sharp as a needle. "We also received reports that you used a different tone of voice when speaking to Mr. Carter, calling him sir, while calling other passengers by their names." "Why?" Melissa closed her eyes for a second. "I didn't realize I did that." Linda tilted her head. "Are you sure? Because the cabin camera shows your voice has changed." Melissa bit her lip, her eyes welling up with tears. I didn't mean to discriminate. I swear." Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "Melissa, the issue isn't whether you meant it or not. The issue is that it happened, and you did nothing to stop it." A chill ran down Melissa's spine. Paul closed his laptop. The investigation wasn't over, but they'd heard enough to see the picture. Now comes the final part, the part Melissa dreads the most. Linda opened the last file and placed it on the table. A photo was on the first page. Photo: Daniel Carter, CEO Horizon Lux, Eurosky's corporate strategic partner. Melissa looked at that photo and felt like someone had sucked all the oxygen out of the room. Richard said slowly, very slowly, "Did you know who he was before you apologized?" Melissa shivered. "No, I only found out after seeing the slides on his laptop, but it was too late." Richard asked again, "What if he wasn't the duly CEO? What if he was just a black guy in a hoodie? Would you apologize?" Melissa opened her mouth, but no sound came out, because she knows the answer, and they know it too. There was a long silence, as if the whole room held its breath. Finally Melissa said, her voice breaking, "I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I was wrong. I was tired. I was stressed. I didn't realize." Richard interrupted. "You're still making excuses," Melissa choked. "No, Richard continued, his voice low but no longer sharp this time. "Melissa, you are not wrong for being tired. You are wrong for letting fatigue guide your prejudice. And you are wrong for thinking that one passenger is not worthy of the same respect as everyone else. He looked deep into her eyes. The problem isn't Daniel Carter. It's that you believe he doesn't belong where you serve. 2 lines of tears fell down Melissa's face on the table. Linda concluded, Melissa Hart, you are suspended indefinitely. You will be required to complete the Elevate Human Dignity course, a cultural training program proposed by Mr. Carter. After that, the disciplinary board will consider whether you can return to work. Paul added, there is no guarantee you will be allowed back. It depends on your efforts. Melissa gasped for breath. Please, give me a chance. I didn't mean to. I've never had an attitude problem before. Richard stood up. No shouting, no banging on the table, no further accusations. He said just one sentence that made Melissa want to collapse. The opportunity is that you are still sitting here. Melissa bowed her head, tears falling to the floor. She didn't dare ask for more, didn't dare look at anyone. She knew from the moment she rolled her eyes at Daniel on the plane, her career was on the line. It's not because Daniel is strong. It's because she let herself be weak. When the 3 of them left the room, only Melissa was left. The room became so large and cold that it was hard to breathe. She covered her face with her hands, not because she was afraid of being fired, but for the first time in her life she looked straight at herself and didn't like what she saw. The late autumn wind in Zurich was so cold that it made one want to pull their head into their coat, but Melissa Hart stood in front of the Eurosky training building for a long time, not daring to go in. Outside, a brand new sign hangs right on the glass door, Elevate Human Dignity Training Center. The name made Melissa's heart clench. She wasn't good at facing the truth. But this course didn't give her any more options. She took a breath and pushed the door open. Inside the hallway, soft yellow light and the smell of new wood warmed the space, but not enough to stop Melissa from shivering. She saw the faces of the other flight attendants, some young, some older. Some looked uncomfortable at being asked to attend the course. Others bowed their heads to avoid the eyes of their colleagues. All of them knew why they were there. A coach approached, his voice gentle. Miss Melissa Hart, please come into room number 3. Melissa nodded and followed. The classroom didn't look like a flight safety training room. There were no model planes, no mock uniforms, just wooden chairs, white walls, and a large screen that read, Lesson 1, People are not your first judgment. Melissa swallowed hard. The first training session starts with a video. A middle-aged man stood in the airport wearing a simple hoodie and jeans. He was asked by security to open his bag not because the scanner had alerted him, but because the inspector's eyes had assessed him before the device spoke. The video then cuts to an elderly woman being called Sweetie, while another passenger is called by name. Then, a young passenger was overlooked because of her slovenly appearance, even though she was a doctor on her way to a night shift. None of the scenes showed Daniel, but to Melissa, she saw him in all of them. The coach asked the class, what do you feel when you watch these scenes? No one answered. Then a girl whispered, I feel bad, because I did the same thing. Another flight attendant continued, I don't think I discriminate, but apparently I do sometimes without realizing it. Then came Melissa. The coach looked at her. Melissa, what do you think? Melissa looked down at her hands. Her thumbs were curled together. She said very softly, her voice trembling, I think I didn't treat the passengers like people. I treated them like judgments. And that was wrong. No one said anything, but a few eyes turned to her. No judgment, just silence as an acknowledgement that at least she was daring to face it. The coach nodded. That is the first step, realizing the truth. The next few weeks were not easy. The course is not just about theory. There are personal reflection sessions where students have to look in the mirror and talk about their true feelings. There are cabin simulations where actors play the role of passengers in various situations. One day they brought a big stopwatch into the classroom. On the screen, Daniel was skipped over when ordering a drink. The coach pressed the clock. They left it for 15 seconds. The classroom was still silent. Then 30 seconds. No one said anything. By the second minute, Melissa felt a chill run down her spine. The coach said, "We have just kept silent for as long as Miss Melissa kept Mr. Carter waiting without responding to his simple request. 2 minutes. Is that a little? But in a cabin, 2 minutes is enough to make a man feel slighted." Melissa bowed her head, eyes stinging. In another session, they taught about ego defenses, how people justify wrong behavior. "I'm tired. I'm stressed. I didn't mean it." The coach looked straight at Melissa. "No idea. Can't erase the effect." The words were like a knife cutting into the feeble defenses Melissa still tried to maintain. That day she buried her face in her hands when class ended. While Melissa faces a journey of self-reflection on the other side, Daniel Carter appears in a completely different context. The Eurosky headquarters in Zurich was busier than usual. Employees gathered in the hallways to see the young black man the press called, "The CEO is redefining dignity in the skies." He came to help the leadership team build the Elevate Human Dignity program. Every time he walked by, employees bowed their heads in respect, not because of the contract, but because of the moral strength he carried. During the open meeting, an employee asked Mr. Carter, "What made you decide not to let this become a scandal?" Daniel smiled very lightly. "Because people who make mistakes are human. When we make a big deal out of a mistake, we give them no chance to fix it. My goal is not to shame an airline. It's to make them see the value of change." The room fell silent, not out of respect, but because the statement touched something very real in everyone. A month later, Daniel was invited to speak to 500 Eurosky flight attendants. Among them was Melissa. She sat in the 4th row clutching her notebook. She didn't dare look up when Daniel walked onto the stage. He begins with his own story, not of being insulted, but of times when he was treated kindly. "There were flights where I was just a guy in a hoodie, and the flight attendants still looked at me with respect. Those little moments, so small they were almost invisible, helped me believe that I had a place in this world." Melissa listened, and her heart ached, because she realized, one small similar moment, she did the opposite. Daniel ended his speech with this sentence: "We don't have to change the world, we just have to change the moment in front of us." The audience stood up and applauded. Melissa stood too, but her hands were shaking uncontrollably. No one noticed her, but she felt like the spotlight was shining on her mistake. At the end of the course, each student was asked to write a reflective letter. The whole class was silent. Melissa in particular had tears falling on the page as she wrote, "I never thought I had prejudice, until I became a living example of it. I wasn't afraid of being punished. I was afraid of becoming someone I didn't respect." The final certificate presentation was simple. No fireworks, no flowers. But when Melissa held the certificate in her hand, it felt heavier than any diploma she had ever received. It was a milestone. Not because she did well, but because she finally admitted her mistake and faced it. That evening she stood on the balcony of her dormitory, looking down at the brightly lit Zurich airport. The plane took off, the flames pushed its back into the night sky. Melissa wondered, will she ever fly again, and if she did return to the skies, who would she be? She didn't have the answers, but at least for once she wanted to find them. O'Hare Airport in the afternoon always has a special kind of noise, not chaos, but a dense wave of overlapping sounds. Daniel Carter dragged his suitcase through the crowd. He had just finished a big talk with investors. His flight was a short one back to New York, but he still felt lightheaded as he approached the boarding gate. "Every airport is a different chapter in life," he once told his team. Little did he know that today's chapter would close a story he thought he had left behind in Zurich. At gate F12, the flight attendant was checking boarding passes. Daniel handed over his boarding pass, smiling as usual. But then he heard a voice, not loud, not trembling, but vaguely familiar. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Carter." He turned back. Melissa Hart stood there. Not the sharp look from before, not the kind of confidence that unintentionally pushed others away, but a new Melissa, more calm, gentle eyes with depth like someone who had just come back from a long journey, but with a different heart. Her uniform no longer bore the lead attendant badge. It was just that of an economy-class flight attendant, a fresh start. She held her hands in front of her stomach and nodded slightly. Her eyes did not avoid Daniel. Daniel nodded in response. A small nod, very small, but enough to make Melissa breathe a little easier. "Thanks," he said. On the plane, Daniel settled into seat 3A. The cabin was small. The seat was much narrower than first class, but he didn't care. For him, every flight was just a place where he temporarily put himself down in the middle of a journey. Up front, Melissa is checking the luggage compartment. Her eyes scanned each passenger, lingering a little longer on a young man struggling to fit his backpack into the overhead compartment. Melissa walked over, chatting gently, helping him rearrange his suitcase so the backpack would fit. No more "I know who you are" tension. No more impatience. Just one thing: respect. Daniel saw the scene, then looked down at his hands. He smiled very slightly, like a smile for life itself. Once the plane had stabilized, Melissa went to his row. "Mr. Carter, would you like water or hot tea?" Her voice was calm, clear, but still held a hint of reserve, not fear, but the caution of someone who respects distance. Daniel replied, "Water is fine. And you can call me Daniel." Melissa was a little startled, not because of the name, but because of the kindness from the person she had wronged. She nodded, "Yes, Daniel." A very short but beautiful moment, like when a gentle breeze opens a window after long days of being closed. When she returned with a glass of water, Melissa placed it gently on the table, but her heart was beating faster than usual. She took a deep breath. "Then say, Daniel, I know it's bygone, but I want to say this just once, if you'll allow me." Daniel put down his glass of water, turned slightly towards her, his eyes neither heavy nor evasive. "I'm listening." Melissa clasped her hands behind her back, as if to keep them from shaking in front of him. "I've learned a lot in the past few months, not just about the process or the service, but about myself. About the blind spots I was refusing to look into before." Her voice was a little choked. "I'm sorry. Not because you're the CEO, but because you're a human being. A human being I didn't treat right." Daniel looked at her for a moment. There was no anger in his eyes, only the peace of someone who had overcome pain and stopped on the other side. He said slowly, "I accept your apology, Melissa, and I believe you have come a long way to be here today." Tears glistened in Melissa's eyes, but she didn't let them fall. "Thank you for not making that the end of me." Daniel shook his head. "No one has the right to end someone else's story. They can only contribute good or bad." She bowed her head, then took a step back. The moment closed gently, like a page of a book just folded after reading. The plane landed at JFK in the late afternoon light. The orange glow of the cabin made everything feel softer, more peaceful. As passengers stood up to get their belongings, Melissa held the door open and greeted each person. As Daniel approached, she said, "Good evening, Daniel." "Me too," he replied, smiling. "Just that." But for both of them, the moment felt like the final full stop to a long story. No fuss, no drama, but complete. Daniel stepped through the plane door, suitcase in tow, and joined the crowd. Melissa watched him for a second, not with regret, but because she knew she had just seen a part of herself reflected in that man's journey. Richard Langford once said, "We don't change because of fear. We change because of hope." Melissa understood that sentence better than ever. She didn't return to the sky to prove herself right. She returned to do right. Outside in the lobby, Daniel looked at the people lining up, the airport staff, giving directions, and the passengers rushing to find their gates. Life goes on. The world still has good people, but it also has dark spots. But sometimes big change doesn't start with a platform or a policy or a slogan. It started with a suitcase, a look, a nod, and two people. choosing to move past their mistakes with compassion instead of anger. He walked straight to the gate, a slight smile on his lips. The story has ended, but the journey of good people never stops. If today's story made you think differently about respect, about human dignity, or reminded you of a moment when you were misjudged, leave a like, a share, and hit subscribe. Because who knows, a little story might touch someone who needs it more than you think. Thank you for sticking with us through this long story. We will meet again in the next stories of justice, dignity, and humanity.